This is our kickoff event for the missions conference. This week we're going to focus on local missions, and then next weekend we're going to have a lot of things that are shifting towards our international missions focus. But today we're starting by talking about how do we engage our community here in Augusta, not just our downtown community, but how do we engage the whole of our city with the gospel of Jesus Christ, particularly through the church. Like, how do we use this church that God has given us, this body of Christ and believers here at First Pres, and how do we begin to engage our community where God has us? So our session has approved some goals for our outreach team for this year, and I just want to read one of them to you. It just says, our goal is to increase opportunities for First Pres members and those outside our church to build relationships with one another with the opportunity to share the gospel. Okay, so this whole morning, that's what we're focused on. That's the aim of this morning, is how do we help you build relationships with other people in our city who don't know Jesus? And how do we begin to build relationships with the purpose of helping draw them into this family that God's given us here at First Pres? Today, as we consider that, we're going to walk through three different little sections. First, we're going to bring up Corey Rogers. He's going to kind of talk about the history of Augusta and how our history shapes where we're at today through the lens of the church, particularly the African American church in our city. I think that'll help us get insight into what we're trying to do in moving forward and reaching our city for the gospel. And then we're going to take a short break after that and give you guys an opportunity to catch your breath. And then Mike Aitchison is in town from Orlando, and he's got an amazing story of what God's been doing there and how they've engaged the community through his church planting efforts. So I hope we can gain some ideas from that of what God has been doing there and what he might do here. And then the third hour, we're going to feed you guys a delicious lunch. And during that time, Chris Williams is going to lead us in a discussion around your tables. So we ask you guys to break up by tables because obviously for us to reach the whole city of Augusta, we're going to have to take different avenues, right? Hope for Augusta can't reach the whole city. City View Seminary can't reach the whole city. We're going to have to take different approaches. So I've asked you to sit with our ministry partners so that you guys can look through the lens of that ministry and look through the things we're looking at to see how might we greater impact our city with the gospel through these particular ministries that God's given us, okay? So let me pray for us, and then I'm going to bring up Corey, and he's going to get us started. God, thank you so much for the opportunity that we have together this morning. God, thank you for these friends who would come out and would engage with us to talk about what you're doing in our city and what you're planning on doing in our city. God, thank you that rain doesn't keep people away, but people are eager to know what's going on in our city in terms of how the gospel is moving forward, God, and we're here begging you, God, would you start a revival here? God, would you use us in whatever means you see necessary, in whatever way you would choose to begin to move the gospel forward in our city to every person, to every age group of people, to every group of people in our city, from the southernest bound to the northernest bound, from the eastbound to the westbound. God, I pray, would you show us how to be salt and light and to bring the hope of the gospel to all those in need. In Christ's name, amen. So I want to bring up Corey Rogers. Corey's a native of Augusta, and he's the curator, is that what you call it? Or he's the historian at the Lucy C. Laney Museum. If you want to know about the history of Augusta, he probably knows more about it than anybody else in our city, so we've invited him in to share with us. So Corey, please come up and share with us this morning. We look forward to it.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, Luke, I don't know how true that is. And there's some really good historians here in Augusta, so they may take issue with that statement. I'm okay, though. I'm okay. Yeah, I'm all right. So to Pastor Mike Herron and Luke and other members of First Pres, I want to thank you for inviting me to give brief remarks today. It's always good to be here at First Pres and to be in the number, see a lot of familiar faces. And, you know, normally I don't like to name drop, but I'm going to name drop anyway, just because I always do that when I come here to First Pres. So, you know, my brother, Carl Rogers, for those of you who are long-standing members of the church here, Carl's now in San Gabriel outside of Los Angeles, or Pasadena, but Carl was a member here for many years, and I kind of joke now that, growing up, I'm 6 years older than Carl, so growing up, I was always the older brother saying, little brother, get away from me, and little brother, stay home, stop bothering me. And now it's the reverse. You have this younger brother who's in the movie industry. I'm like, just put me in the credits. Just that's all. Just put me in the credits. Just give me a shout out at the Oscars or something like that. So, it's always, good when, I can just think back on my relationship with him, and it still continues to grow every single day. But thank you, Luke and Mike and everyone once again for bringing me out. Augusta. Augusta has a unique story. Its history talks of nationally renowned schools, lucrative businesses, heroes of the military, and legendary entertainers. But in most instances, the success of the schools, the businesses, the military heroes, and entertainers would not have been possible if it not were for the spiritual and cultural backbone of Augusta, its churches. Since the founding of the United States, the church has played a major role in the development of Black institutions and communities throughout the country. Augusta, Georgia is no exception. What I will endeavor to do today is give you a glimpse into some of the major religious centers in Augusta, while highlighting some of the more prominent members to come out of those churches. So, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, everyone loves a good origin story. To talk about the importance and significance of the Black church and Augusta, one must go to the source. One must go to the place where it all began, Springfield Baptist Church. And I took my title, actually, and obviously a biblical reference, but if you visit Springfield, as you see here in the background, you'll see, and they went both down into the water, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Springfield Baptist Church in downtown Augusta is a special church for a variety of reasons. Springfield was founded in 1787 by Reverend Jesse Peters Golphin. So kind of let that marinate for a moment. 1787. That means that here in Augusta, we have a 236-year-old Baptist church. Historians have argued and debated, but there is no denying that Springfield is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Black Baptist church of continuous service in the United States. Springfield, along with Silver Bluff Baptist Church in Beach Island, First Bryan Baptist, and First African Baptist in Savannah, collectively comprise a good chunk of the origin story for the Black Baptist church in our country. Springfield would play a major role in the development of Black life and culture in Augusta. A village sprang up around the church that would be comprised of both enslaved and free people of color, preachers, bricklayers, carpenters, and so much more. Even during the antebellum period, Springfield was a thriving, diverse community, which is counter to the narrative often told about African Americans being a monolithic group pre-Civil War. Several important events occurred at Springfield after the Civil War. In 1866, Black leaders began to organize at Springfield. The organization they formed was called the Georgia Equal Rights Association. Today, this organization is called the Republican Party of Georgia. In 1867, this gentleman here in the middle of this mural, in 1867, Reverend William Jefferson White, the associate pastor of Springfield, co-founded the Augusta Baptist Institute. In 1869, when Reverend White left Springfield to start Harmony Baptist Church near Gwinnett Street, today Laney Walker, the school moved with him. 10 years later, the Augusta Baptist Institute moved to Friendship Baptist Church in Atlanta. Today, we know this school for young men started at Springfield as Morehouse College. Over the years, Morehouse has enjoyed the connection it has had with Springfield, and for a long stretch, Springfield would host Morehouse Day, where the incoming freshmen and Augusta alumni of the school would attend a special church service. The mural you see here is in the lobby area as the church connects. So for those of you who've never been to Springfield Baptist down by the Cyber campus on Reynolds Street on the west end of Reynolds, you have the St. John's building in the back, and then you have their main sanctuary in the front. They call it the St. John's building simply because in 1840 they purchased that from St. John's Methodist Episcopal Church. So they purchased that building, moved it over, and that became their main sanctuary until 1901 when they built their current brick sanctuary. So as you transition from one part to the next, you'll see this mural which highlights various graduates from Morehouse. You all will recognize Maynard Jackson, Hartfield Jackson International Airport, Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, one of the great educators of the 20th century and mentor to Dr. King, Edwin Moses, Mike Herron, I know you track star, high hurdles, right, Mike? So Edwin Moses from the Olympics and several other graduates. And for some reason, and I'm still trying to find out the reason why, but Bill Cosby included in the number. Now, my theory is, of course, his large donations, his son attended Morehouse, and so the artist decided to include and weave him in there. But, it's kind of weird now and sort of in retrospect. So when I'm taking people on tours through Springfield, I'm like, yeah, I got to explain Bill Cosby, right? And everything. So, okay, people, here we go. So I guess the artist didn't know that 20 years. Anyway, we're not going to go there. So I mentioned that a village sprang up around the church, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the things in the village. So Ware High School was established in the Springfield Village in 1880. Ware High School was the first public high school created for African Americans in the state of Georgia. It remained open for almost 20 years, but Ware would close in the 1890s. The African American citizens of Augusta were upset with the closure of Ware, so they took it to court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. Cummings versus Richmond County Board of Education. The Supreme Court ruled that the Board of Education in Augusta could close Ware. Now, what does that have to do with anything? How many of you are familiar with Plessy v. Ferguson? Show of hands. Okay. So most people and most historians, classroom teachers, they talk about Plessy. Very rarely do they talk about Cummings. Cummings versus Richmond County of 1897, Plessy v. Ferguson 1896, both of these court cases codified Jim Crow for the next 60 years. So Springfield has played a vital role not just in the development of Augusta, but in the development of institutions that have impacted our state and nation. One of Springfield's 20th century members was attorney James Nabrett Jr. His father, Reverend James Nabrett Sr., was pastor of Springfield from 1912 to 1921. Once again, by a show of hands, how many of you know Brown v. Board of Education? Familiar with that? Okay. So, and let me just do a quick follow-up, and you can feel free to shout the answer at me. I'm cool with that. So when most people talk about Brown v. Board, what's the one person that they most equate with Brown versus Board? Thurgood Marshall is usually the name that rings a bell when we talk about Brown. What is often not talked about is that there were other pivotal players in the case brought by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. One of those players was Springfield Baptist Church owned James Nabrett Jr., who would play a major role in developing the strategy that would become a winning argument. Now, as a historical aside, Attorney Nabrett, while dean of the Howard University Law School in Washington, served as a mentor to a young law student named John H. Ruffin. If you recognize the name John Ruffin would go on to become the leading civil rights attorney in Augusta during the modern civil rights movement and the first African-American chief of Georgia's Court of Appeals. The name of the courthouse at the Judicial Center, not far from here, is the John H. Ruffin Courthouse. And we will come back to Ruffin later in my remarks. Now, Springfield gave rise to several daughter churches in Augusta. Oh, and before I go any further, this is the park. I'm pretty sure many of you have either taken a walk there one day, having with the dog or with the family, or have passed by there in your car. This park was dedicated in 2002. The two public art pieces you see here, the bottom piece that sits in the lake is the title of my talk today, and they went both down into the water. And the tall piece is called the Tower of Aspiration, both done by Chicago-based artist Richard Hunt. Springfield's first daughter church came in 1840 when the Independent Baptist Church was established on the east boundary of Augusta. In 1844, it changed its name to what we know today, Thankful Baptist Church. During the 1890s, Thankful hosted many national figures, to include Booker T. Washington in 1899 and Dr. W.B. Du Bois in 1898. Another one of Springfield's daughter churches is Union Baptist Church, established in 1879. Roughly 70 members submitted a letter of separation to their mother church of Union, and it was accepted. Let me stop for a moment. I'm going to interject something right here, and feel free to ask me this if we have time for Q&A, which I'm sure we have, but I didn't put this in my notes, but I think maybe it's important to interject because there's a cultural aspect to Union's establishment. Within the African-American dynamic, you start to see sort of these tiers develop, where many of your fairer-skinned African-Americans, more often than not, those who were the sons and daughters of many of the planters in the area, they saw themselves as a lot more elite as some of their darker-skinned counterparts. This was sort of an attitude that developed during the antebellum period, colonial period, but it carried over in the post-Civil War period. And so Union, when it was established, most of those 70 members were considered themselves more elite than other African Americans in the city. Many of them were very fair complexion. As I will indicate here with some of their members, I'm going to give you some examples now. But I thought it was important to kind of put that context on Union. Union has boasted many famous and influential members, to include John Hope, the first black president of Morehouse College and Atlanta University, and Frank Yerby, considered one of the great writers of the 20th century. Yerby was known for including pieces of Augusta in his short stories. Of his 33 novels, only one is set in Augusta, A Woman Called Fancy. And for those of you who would like to go home, or if you've already read A Woman Called Fancy, when you get to page 20, he mentions this little church on Telfair Street called First Presbyterian Church. Oh, by the way, as a little quick aside, March 16th, 11 o'clock, put on your calendar, we're going to unveil, we meaning Payne College, the Haynes Alumni, the Lucy Craft Laney Museum, and the Georgia Historical Society will unveil the Frank Yerby marker here in Augusta. So we're very excited about that at the corner of 8th and Hall Street. And I didn't put a lot in here about Yerby in terms of his sort of stats, but if you're just kind of wondering, 33 novels, 60 million copies sold worldwide, 12 New York Times bestsellers, 3 books made into Hollywood movies. His first book, 20th Century Fox paid him $150,000 for the rights to that, so quite an impressive resume. Union has gone through a transformation in recent decades, with almost $1 million going in to restore and preserve this beautiful church. Here's the aforementioned Harmony Baptist Church, established in 1869 by Reverend William Jefferson White. Their superintendent of Sunday schools was a local educator by the name of Augustus Robertson, or A.R. Johnson. Harmony would also be the second location of the Augusta Baptist Institute, later called Morehouse College. Springfield's dominance would persist well into the late 19th century, but something would happen in Augusta that would move Springfield off the top of the religious hill. This something, which is actually a someone, that I'm talking about, well, it all started in Hepzibah, Georgia, February 5th, 1858. A baby boy was born. This baby boy would be nurtured at Franklin Covenant Baptist Church in Hepzibah. He came to Augusta after the Civil War to attend the Augusta Baptist Institute. He was ordained in his teens and pastored many a church from Augusta to Hepzibah to LaGrange before coming back to Augusta and becoming the pastor of Central African Baptist Church on 12th Street. Now, Central African would have a split. Half the congregation wanted to follow one pastor. The other half of the congregation wanted to follow the other pastor. So this young, charismatic minister took his half of the congregation, and they left. They began meeting at Union Baptist, and in August of 1885, this young man, Reverend Charles Thomas, or C.T. Walker, established Beulah Baptist Church, later to be called Tabernacle Baptist Church. So, how did Reverend Walker knock an entire church, Springfield, off the perch as the dominant church in Augusta? C.T. Walker was a force to be reckoned with. He was learned, gifted in the pulpit, and made connections with people, both black and white, north and south. He gained an international reputation and worldwide acclaim in 1891 when he took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, stopping along the way for 1 month in London, England. It wasn't long after this trip that news publications began referring to Reverend Walker as the Black Spurgeon, a reference to the renowned 19th century English theologian Charles Spurgeon. In 1899, Reverend Walker took his talents to Harlem, New York, where he became the pastor of Mount Olivet Baptist Church. Left in charge was interim pastor, C.T. Walker's best friend and biographer, Reverend Silas X. Floyd. Although in Harlem, Reverend Walker maintained a close relationship with Augusta, often coming back from time to time to raise money for the Tabernacle Old Folks Home, which he started to care for the formerly enslaved and elderly of the church. In 1903, Reverend Walker returned to Augusta and assumed his duties as pastor of Tabernacle until his death in 1921. But the early 20th century Tabernacle, by the early 20th century, Tabernacle had become the epicenter of black religious life in Augusta. Reverend Walker wanted to make it clear to everyone that all roads led to Tabernacle by building a church that would represent its status as the top of the proverbial food chain. This is the current and second Tabernacle Baptist Church. The cornerstone of this building was laid in March of 1914, and it opened officially in 1921, a few months after C.T. Walker passed away. During his time as pastor of Tabernacle, many of the most famous people in America visited him in Augusta. President of the United States, William Howard Taft, billionaire and richest man in the world at the time, John D. Rockefeller, educator and leader Booker T. Washington, and world-renowned scientist George Washington Carver. One of the main reasons we know so much about Augusta's black community in the early 20th century is due in part to this man. This is Reverend Silas X. Floyd. Floyd was a preacher, teacher, author, poet, historian, administrator, but he was also an editor. And how he found time to do all of this, I have no earthly idea, but hey, it is what it is. In 1915, the Augusta Chronicle began the publication of a separate section of news exclusive to the black community. It went by different names, but was known originally as Notes Among Colored People or Notes Among the Colored. So from 1915 until the early 60s, Augusta Chronicle became a segregated newspaper. He used his platform to highlight many important aspects of black society. For example, if a popular group like the world-famous Fisk Jubilee Singers was coming to town, or if someone was taking a vacation, he talked about it as well. Go figure. So Notes became a one-stop shop that covered all manners of black society and culture. In the post-World War II era, Tabernacle would be the leading proponent of civil rights. During this time, the church was led by Reverend Charles Spencer Hamilton. He partnered with Thankful's pastor, Reverend N.T. Young, and a young lawyer fresh out of law school named John Ruffin, as well as other pastors in the area, high school students, and students from Payne College who were led by Silas Norman, the brother of Jesse Norman. Their effort would lead to much of the change that would come in the early 1960s. Tabernacle was also the first church that Dr. King visited as the iconic civil rights leader, April 1962. Today, Tabernacle registers an active membership and regular churchgoers numbering north of 11,000, with 3 locations: the main campus on Laney Walker, the Evans campus, and a recently opened Aiken, South Carolina campus. This is Bethel AME Church, founded in 1852, and it still remains an active congregation now in Harrisburg. The church you see here, unfortunately, was torn down in 2006. The gentleman you see here is Horace Dawson, one of Bethel's, former members, who would go on to become United States Ambassador to Botswana under the Carter administration. Mother Trinity CME Church was founded in 1840. They came out of St. John's Methodist Church. Reverend Holsey would have the vision to start a school in Augusta called Payne Institute. However, Payne was one of those rare instances in the late 19th century of 2 denominations, the white United Methodists and the black CMEs, coming together to establish a school. One of Trinity's members was Amanda America Dixon Toomer, whose house is not far from First Pres. Through her inherited wealth, she became in the 1880s the wealthiest African-American woman in the country. This is St. Mary's Episcopal Church. Father Turner Morris, who pastored here, was an active member of the civil rights movement in Augusta. I've included a good friend of mine, and some of you may even know him. He kind of gets around, even at 95. So this is Father Louis Bowler, who is 95 years old, still lives here in the Augusta area. His older brother was a Tuskegee Airman. They grew up here in the Augusta area, and he was very active in the civil rights movement and a very close friend to Dr. King. Through Christ Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church writ large, Lucy Craft Laney was able to establish the Haynes Normal and Industrial Institute. In 1974, Governor Carter recognized the achievements of Miss Laney with a portrait in the state capitol. Today, the church has dwindled to about 30 to 35 members, but among those 35 members includes Dr. Cheryl Evans Jones, Payne College's current president. I wanted to also briefly mention 2 members of Good Shepherd Baptist Church, founder Reverend Essie Mae McIntyre and her son, former Augusta Mayor Ed M. McIntyre. Beulah Grove Baptist Church was the site of Dr. King's last visit to Augusta on March 23, 1968. Dr. King was getting ready for the second march, or the Poor People's March on Washington, when he was called to Memphis and he was assassinated. Augusta's African American churches have stood at the crossroads of development and progress in Augusta going back to the colonial period. In most instances, the black church has been a space not just for worship, but also to nurture future community activists, educators, entrepreneurs, and authors. As the 21st century continues, these churches and the many others that I did not highlight today will continue to be a force for positive change in the river region and beyond. Thank you. And Mike said I couldn't leave unless I take at least 2 questions. So I'll take 2, possibly 3, maybe 4 if I'm feeling good. Okay. Any questions, anybody, about any of the churches I've mentioned, any of the people that I've mentioned, and maybe some of the things that these churches are doing today to kind of connect the past with what we're doing now? Anything? Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Tell us about
It's a very good point. Beulah Grove has been very active in terms of community outreach. And I think it may be Beulah Grove, it may be another church in the area, but their mantra was a church without walls. In other words, their ministry goes beyond the four walls, so to speak. And so if you go to Beulah Grove, if you go to that area we call the Bethlehem community, if you go there, you'll kind of see the progress it's made. Housing, affordable housing for low and middle income, senior living centers. They have a health clinic, for example, the Lamar Health Clinic, named for the Lamar School of Nursing, founded by Miss Laney. I didn't mention that in my talk, but that's neither here nor there. So Beulah Grove has had a lot to do. I also have to think that one of the reasons for that, their leadership at the church. So Reverend Sam Davis was there for a very long time, and he was sort of instrumental in getting a lot of the outside the church development going, but also some of their members have been very instrumental. I have to think that having Hawthorne Welcher as a member of the church, who's Director of Housing and Community Development for the City of Augusta, he has been very, very instrumental in getting a lot of the affordable housing, kind of cleaning up some of the area. And one thing I'll give Hawthorne credit for, Hawthorne will not make a move when it comes to a historic property without first calling either myself, Eric Montgomery at Historic Augusta, or both of us. So whenever there's a historic property in either Bethlehem or Laney Walker, we talk about it and look at the best course of action to proceed. Case in point would be the C.T. Walker House, which was just turned over to Housing and Community. And so we saved another historic property. But yeah, Beulah Grove has been very active. Antioch Baptist Church, also in Bethlehem, has been very active in terms of going out into the community and making their presence felt by cleaning up the community and building affordable housing for those living around the church.
Corey, you're also familiar with Bell Terrace. Can you speak a little bit about Bell Terrace?
So I just spoke at Bell Terrace, Mike. I kind of kicked off Black History Month at Bell Terrace, and that was kind of nice because I was coming home. Now, I got to clean up something over here, then I'm going to come back to Bell Terrace. I made a comment about the Baptists at the table, and y'all were looking at me like, oh my goodness. So I grew up, I'm a member of Tabernacle, but I grew up at a Baptist church on the hill. But in terms of neighborhood or community, I grew up near Bell Terrace. So Carl and I grew up, we could walk to Bell Terrace. And so just like First Pres, Christ Presbyterian Church, Bell Terrace is kind of doing the same ministry, but out in South Augusta. So you can see some of the community outreach, helping the homeless, a lot of the things that Bell Terrace has been working on since I can remember. And so I think, and most of my neighbors were members of Bell Terrace Presbyterian. So Bell Terrace, and I can't remember exactly it wasn't a split, but there were members of Christ Presbyterian that eventually started Bell Terrace. Presbyterians worshiping out in South Augusta who wanted a worship place closer to home, if you will. So as I mentioned before, most of my neighbors were members of Bell Terrace, and many of them could actually walk to the church. Interesting thing about Christ Presbyterian, both First Pres and Bell Terrace, they're all mentioned in the history of Christ Presbyterian. So all these churches are interconnected.
You showed a picture of the Bethel AME that's no longer standing. What efforts are available or being used to preserve some of these church buildings? And I guess maybe just the historic side, or other things specific to these churches?
Well, for Augusta, let me say this. For this particular neighborhood, advocacy has been the biggest course of action. Case in point would be Mother Trinity. For those of you who may remember the backstory, some years ago, Atlanta Gaslight owned the property where Mother Trinity currently sits on 8th Street, and there was a gas contamination that happened over decades. So in 1999, the church congregation moved from downtown out to the Glen Hills community in South Augusta, and they've been worshiping there ever since. Well, Atlanta Gaslight, decades later, said, we want our land back, so we're going to clear this church out. And so it was right around the time, let me say this, it was right around the time several things all kind of converged at once. We wrote a successful application for their historic marker in 2016. But the other thing that happened, I think they're still around. There may be members assembled today that are members of this particular organization that I'm about to say. But there's a photography group out of South Carolina called the Chicks That Click. Yes, the Chicks That Click. And they approached me about getting into Mother Trinity. So we called the church so they can get into the old church. What happened? The word had already gotten out in the community that they were going to tear the church down. This is around 2015-16. So they wanted to take pictures to preserve the interior of the church. What they didn't realize was that when the exhibit went live, people started seeing it, and then all of a sudden the letters started coming in, the emails started coming in, the Augusta Canal Authority got involved in it, Historic Augusta got involved in it, the Georgia Land Bank got involved in it, and so everyone kind of rallied around Mother Trinity, and we were able to save the church. So in certain communities, just advocacy, or if, someone has deep pockets and they can, anyway. But, advocacy is really the big thing. And that's because not every community in Augusta is locally protected. So the local ordinances really only extend to Old Town, Somerville, and downtown. As a result of that, even with you being on the National Registry of Historic Places, it still won't save many of the historic sites in Augusta. So we saved Mother Trinity, but we did not save Bethel. And I really hate that because it was such a beautiful church. Such a beautiful church. Oh, any other questions? Luke, I saw you. Yeah.
Is there a connection between Christ Presbyterian, where we see money, and First Presbyterian here? Was there a connection there?
Between the two churches? Well,
was it Presbyterian connected, or was it divided because of the race?
Well, my understanding, at least according to the history of both First Pres and Christ Presbyterian, as I was reading through their history, members of Christ Presbyterian came out of First Pres. So there was a direct connection between the two churches. There was that connection.
Was that connection good, or was it negative?
I'm not sure if it was. It didn't seem to me like, from my understanding, or at least what I've read, that it didn't seem like that it was a schism or something to that effect. Mike.
In our history, what's been recorded is there was 57 members of our church at the end of the Emancipation Proclamation that were African Americans or black. Over the next few years, Christ Pres was started. 27 of those members stayed as members of First Pres, and the rest went and joined others to found Christ Presbyterian. That's what our history.
Yeah, but I don't recall, Mike, there being any friction, if you will. Yeah.
And there was support both ways, I understand.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier how C.T. Walker often gained financial support from both blacks and whites. It was the same premise with Miss Laney as well. Presbyterians, both primarily in the North, but Presbyterians, North and South, really helped her develop many of her institutions, the Lamar School of Nursing, the Haynes Institute. So there seemed to be somewhat of a camaraderie.
Lady from Macon, and her father was Presbyterian pastor.
Yeah, Mike, Reverend David Laney. He was a carpenter by trade, but he was also a pastor of Washington Avenue Presbyterian Church. It's a still active congregation in downtown Macon, and there are still descendants of the Laney family that attend Washington Avenue. So it's pretty cool to get to talk to them from time to time. Miss Laney had 9 brothers and sisters, so there are Laneys everywhere, kind of fanned out all over the South as far as I know, but on occasion they come down to visit me here in Augusta.
I know your assignment was not to talk about building our church. Your assignment was not to talk about the nursing institute. But please just mention that how Ms. Laney founded the nursing school that became part of university.
Well, Mike, even though my assignment was not to talk about the Lamar School, I think there is a teachable moment embedded in the foundation of the Lamar School. So in the 1890s, Miss Laney wanted to create a institute that would help facilitate the training of young black nurses. What was happening at the time in Augusta was that Dr. George N. Stoney was starting to develop a strong class of doctors. And what do I mean by that? He was getting doctors from other areas to come to Augusta, and he was also getting homegrown doctors like T.W. Josie, for example, who went off to medical school, came back to Augusta, really at the behest of Dr. Stoney. So, Miss Laney sees that all these doctors are coming to Augusta. In addition, she's envisioning a place that would train these nurses where the black community could receive better, if not quality, health care. So she partners one white physician, Dr. William Dowdy, one black physician, Dr. George Stoney. And through this partnership, money set aside by Gasway Lamar, thus the name, the Lamar School of Nursing. So, I think that we sometimes paint a very simplistic view of the late 19th, early 20th century. And I mentioned the term Jim Crow on several occasions throughout my talk. Yes, Jim Crow was the law of the land, or legal segregation. It was the law of the land. However, history is a very complicated subject. History is a very multi-layered subject. So even in the midst of Jim Crow, you still had these instances of black Americans and white Americans finding common ground and working together.
Thank you for talking to it. And a question, the churches that are historically black that you described, at Tabernacle, Springfield, are they still principally people of color, or have they become any more interracial? And what are your thoughts on the prospects of churches becoming more interracial?
Well, they're still predominantly African American. I know that Tabernacle, and Mike, you might be able to kind of peel back a little bit of what I'm about to say, because I think two of us may have even talked about this before, but I think Tabernacle, at least under the leadership of Reverend Moss, the current pastor is Reverend Charles Goodman Jr., but when Reverend Otis Moss Jr. was here, they would do things, Tabernacle would do things like they would have the pulpit exchanges with First Baptist Church, where First Baptist minister would come down to Tabernacle, Reverend Moss would go up on Walton Way, do things like that. Another good example would be up on the hill when Reverend Charles Smith was pastor of Elam Baptist Church on Auburn Street up on the hill. They would often partner with many of the white congregations in Somerville. So I see that those olive branches still going out. I think the statement probably still holds true that one of the more segregated times in America is still 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. But I think that there's room for improvement. First Pres is a good example of how, diversity, breeds success, brotherhood, sisterhood, working together. Where I see a lot of that embedded in this church. And so I think that there's always room for that growth to happen. Okay? Thank you, guys. I appreciate your time and enjoy.